When people imagine the Victorian era, their minds often drift images of elegant gowns, stately mansions, and romance-filled walks through manicured gardens. Popular culture has painted a picture of the 19th century as an age of refined manners, passionate love letters, and dignified family life. From the novels of Jane Austen, though technically earlier, often lumped with Victorian ideals, to the lavish adaptations on television and film, the era is often romanticized as one of courtly love and noble matrimony. But behind the satin gloves and candlelit parlors lurked a much darker reality. Victorian marriage was rarely the fairy tale union that later generations imagined. Instead, it was a social contract, deeply rooted in law, economics, and patriarchy. Women, regardless of wealth or status, were bound to systems that stripped them of autonomy, limited their choices, and defined their value largely in relation to men. Marriage was less about love and more about property, power, and control. This contradiction between myth and reality is precisely why the subject of Victorian marriage continues to fascinate. It tells us much about the rigid structures of the past and about the foundations of inequality that still echo in modern society. To understand what marriage really meant in the 19th century, we need to look beyond lace and romance novels and confront the stark truths that govern people's lives. Marriage in Victorian England began long before the wedding day, with the ritual of courtship. Far from being a free-spirited pursuit of love, courtship was a highly structured process bound by etiquette, family expectations, and strict social codes. The path to the altar was less about passion and more about navigating the intricate dance of reputation, money, and respectability. Young men and women were rarely left alone together. Respectable courtship required supervision, often by a chaperone, usually a mother, aunt, or older female relative. Private moments were considered dangerous, for they might lead to impropriety or, worse, scandal. Even a seemingly innocent carriage ride could cause gossip if done without proper oversight. Communication between prospective lovers often took place through carefully crafted letters, which themselves had to balance sentiment with restraint. Too much emotion could appear unseemly. Too little might signal disinterest. Walks in gardens, dances at balls, and visits to the theater were among the few socially acceptable ways for couples to interact. But always, eyes were watching. Romantic attraction alone was rarely enough. Marriage was as much a business transaction as it was a personal bond. A man's wealth, family connections, and prospect determined his eligibility, while a woman's reputation, dowry, and perceived virtue determined hers. For middle and upper-class families, daughters were often seen as assets in a broader strategy of social advancement. A well-made match could secure property, forge political alliances, or elevate a family standing. A poor match, however, could ruin a woman's prospects entirely. Reputation was everything. A single misstep, being caught in a compromising situation, a whisper of scandal, or even being seen as too forward, could destroy a young woman's chances at a respectable marriage. The Victorian obsession with purity meant that women lived under constant scrutiny, their behavior policed by society at every turn. Once a couple reached the point of engagement, the relationship entered a more formal stage. Engagements were often announced publicly, turning what might have been a private understanding into a binding social contract. Breaking off an engagement was no small matter. It could lead to humiliation, gossip, and in some cases, lawsuits for breach of promise. The giving of an engagement ring became increasingly common in the Victorian period, especially after the discovery of diamond mines in South Africa in the late 1800s. The ring was not just a symbol of love, but also of financial security, a tangible sign of the man's ability to provide. During the engagement period, couples were granted slightly more freedom to spend time together, though still under watchful eyes. Letters became more intimate, discussions of the future more practical. Yet even here, the relationship was less about two individuals and more about the merging of families and fortunes. For women, the stakes were especially high. A broken engagement, whether a fault or not, could mark her as undesirable. Worse still was the possibility of a sexual indiscretion before marriage. A woman who lost her virtue outside of wedlock, willingly or through coercion, risked total social ruin. Respectable society was unforgiving, and unlike men, women had few avenues for redemption. This imbalance reveals the double standard at the heart of Victorian morality. Men were granted far more freedom in their private lives, while women were expected to embody purity, chastity, and restraint. Courtship, in this sense, was not just about finding a partner, but about surviving a system stacked against women. Victorian England was obsessed with marriage, and nowhere was this more visible than in what was often called the marriage market. This term wasn't just a metaphor. It reflected the blunt reality that marriage was often treated as an exchange of wealth, property, and status, where daughters were commodities and marriage contracts resembled business negotiations. In many middle and upper-class families, daughters were groomed from childhood for their future roles as wives. Their education emphasized accomplishments designed to attract a suitable husband. Playing the piano, embroidery, drawing, polite conversation, and fluency in French or Italian. Academic rigor was often discouraged, as it was believed that too much intellectual ability made women undesirable. For wealthy families, marriage was a way to consolidate power and ensure dynastic continuity. Aristocratic unions were carefully arranged to keep estates within certain circles. Among the middle classes, a daughter's marriage could be the key to climbing the social ladder. Even in modest households, the financial stability of a daughter's husband was seen as crucial, not just for her, but for the security of the entire family. Dowries were a central part of the marriage market. A bride's family often provided money, property, or goods as part of the union. For some, this was a way of ensuring their daughter's comfort. For others, it was a necessary bargaining chip to secure a desirable match. The absence of a dowry could severely limit a woman's prospects, regardless of her personal qualities. The size of a dowry also influenced the type of suitors a woman could attract. Wealthy men expected substantial financial contributions, while women from less affluent backgrounds often had to marry men of lower status or seek husbands willing to overlook the lack of funds. By the mid-19th century, newspapers and periodicals carried personal ads for men and women seeking spouses. These ads were often blunt, focusing on financial situations rather than romance. A typical advertisement might emphasize a man's annual income or a woman's dowry and connections. Marriage brokers and professional matchmakers also operated in cities, arranging introductions between eligible individuals. In fashionable resorts and urban salons, mothers would parade their daughters in hopes of attracting wealthy suitors. Balls and social gatherings became stages where marital negotiations played out under the guise of entertainment. The marriage market metaphor was not lost on contemporaries. Satirical cartoons of the era often depicted young women being auctioned off to the highest bidder, while cynical commentators noted the transactional nature of matrimony. Beneath the polite rituals of tea parties and dances, the stakes were brutally real. A daughter who failed to marry was often seen as a burden, a spinster whose unmarried status reflected poorly on her family. Unmarried women were denied many of the rights, respect, and social standing that wives and mothers enjoyed. This stigma created enormous pressure to marry, regardless of love or compatibility. After negotiations, the introductions, and the formal engagement, the culmination of Victorian courtship was the wedding itself. But here, too, the image of a romantic, fairy tale event often clashed with reality. Weddings in early Victorian England varied widely by class. Among the poor, ceremonies were often modest affairs, held in local parish churches with little extravagance. Middle and upper-class weddings, however, became increasingly elaborate as the century progressed. The most influential wedding of the era was that of Queen Victoria to Prince Albert in 1840. Victoria's choice of a white gown, a departure from the colored dresses commonly worn at the time, set a trend that spread rapidly among the middle and upper classes. White became a symbol of purity and virtue, cementing itself as a traditional bridal color. Flowers, too, became significant symbols. Orange blossoms, representing fertility and innocence, were especially popular. Bouquets were chosen not merely for their beauty, but for their symbolic meanings, as Victorians were fascinated with the language of flowers. The wedding itself was steeped in religious and legal formality. Couples were required to marry in a Church of England ceremony, unless they belonged to another recognized faith. The vows reinforced the patriarchal structure of marriage. Wives promised to obey, husbands who love and protect. After the ceremony, couples signed a marriage register, a legally binding step that transformed women's identities. Upon marriage, a woman's legal existence was subsumed into her husband's under the doctrine of coverture. She no longer owned property independently, could not sign contracts, and was legally represented by her husband. For the wealthy, weddings were opportunities to display social status. Lavish receptions with fine dining, music, and large guest lists became more common in the later Victorian period. Wedding gifts, often recorded in newspapers, reflected the wealth and connections of the couple. For working-class families, weddings were simpler, sometimes followed by a modest meal or gathering at a local tavern. Despite the differences, the symbolism remained powerful. Marriage was both a social expectation and a rite of passage, marking the transition from daughter to wife. The practice of the honeymoon also gained popularity in the Victorian period, particularly among the middle and upper classes. Couples would often travel to seaside resorts, historic sites, or even abroad if wealthy enough. Yet the honeymoon was not always a romantic escape it is imagined to be today. For many women, it was their first introduction to marital intimacy, an experience often fraught with fear, confusion, or even trauma, given the lack of sexual education available to them. To understand the true weight of Victorian marriage, one must examine the law. Marriage was not simply a personal union. It was a legal arrangement that dramatically altered a woman's identity. At the heart of Victorian marital law was the principle of coverture. Rooted in English common law, this doctrine held that a married woman's legal identity was covered by her husband's. In practice, this meant a wife could not own property independently. She could not enter contracts, sue, or be sued in her own name. Her wages and inheritance automatically belonged to her husband. In essence, upon marriage, a woman ceased to exist legally as an individual. She became an extension of her husband, her rights subsumed under his authority. This arrangement gave husbands sweeping control over household wealth. A woman who brought a dowry into marriage lost all legal claim to it. Even inheritances left to a wife could be seized by her husband unless special provisions were made. It wasn't until the Married Women's Property Act of 1870 that women gained a right to keep earnings from their own work and inherit smaller sums of property. Further reforms in 1882 and 1893 expanded these rights, finally allowing wives to own and control property independently. But for most of the Victorian era, wives lived with few legal protections. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of coverture was custody law. In cases of marital separation, children automatically belonged to the father, regardless of the mother's role in raising them. This meant that women who fled abusive or unhappy marriages often faced the devastating reality of losing their children entirely. Reforms came slowly. The Custody of Infants Act, 1839, gave some mothers a right to petition for custody of children under 7, but only if they could prove good moral character. Even then, fathers retained the stronger claim. Before 1857, divorce in England was available only through a costly and complex Act of Parliament, essentially restricting it to the wealthy elite. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 made civil divorce possible, but the law was heavily biased against women. A man could divorce his wife on the grounds of simple adultery. A woman, however, had to prove adultery plus an additional offense, such as cruelty, desertion, or bigamy. This double standard reflected the Victorian obsession with female chastity and the assumption that men had broader sexual rights. For most women, divorce remained inaccessible, socially scandalous, financially crippling, and legally stacked against them. In short, Victorian marriage transformed women into dependents under the law. Whatever affection or companionship a marriage might contain, it existed within a framework that stripped wives of independence and reinforced male authority. If the law set the boundaries of Victorian marriage, daily domestic life filled in the reality. The household was considered the woman's domain, but this authority was tightly circumscribed by rigid gender expectations. Victorian society idolized the image of the wife as the angel in the house, a phrase popularized by Coventry Patmore's 1854 poem. This ideal portrayed women as selfless, pure, nurturing, and morally superior. Their role was to provide a haven of peace for their husbands, raising children and maintaining a home of virtue. But this poetic vision carried a heavy burden. Women were expected to suppress personal ambition, intellectual pursuits, and even personal desires in order to serve others. The household was framed as a miniature moral kingdom, with the wife as guardian of its spiritual and emotional health. In contrast, men were seen as breadwinners, protectors, and decision-makers. A husband was expected to provide financially, exercise authority, and represent the family in the outside world. His labor earned the income. Her labor maintained the home. This division was presented as natural, though in reality it was a carefully constructed system that reinforced patriarchal dominance. A man's work was valued with wages and legal recognition, while a woman's work, though equally essential, was unpaid and socially invisible. For middle-class wives, daily life revolved around supervising servants, managing the household budget, planning meals, educating children, and maintaining social appearances. Even without formal employment, the responsibilities were immense. Working-class wives faced even harsher realities. Many labored outside the home, in factories as laundresses, seamstresses, or domestic servants, while also caring for children and maintaining households with far fewer resources. Poverty magnified the burdens of Victorian domestic life, leaving little room for the angelic ideals celebrated in literature. Within the home, the husband's authority was considered absolute. Victorian marriage manuals advised wives to obey without question, framing submission as a woman's sacred duty. A good wife was one who deferred to her husband in all things, smoothing over his temper, managing his needs, and sacrificing her own comfort for his satisfaction. Failure to meet these standards invited criticism not only from husbands but from society at large. Neighbors, relatives, and religious leaders often judged women harshly, reinforcing the pressure to conform. The polished drawing rooms and tidy nurseries presented in Victorian illustrations often masked the immense strain placed on women. Behind the curtains of respectability, many wives struggled with exhaustion, isolation, and resentment. Yet their struggles were rarely acknowledged, as the myth of a contented, devoted Victorian wife dominated public discourse. Few aspects of Victorian marriage are as misunderstood as sex. Popular imagination paints Victorians as prudish, stiff, and terrified of intimacy. While it's true that sexual morality was tightly policed, the reality was more complex. The era combined public repression with private obsession. Sexual education was almost non-existent, especially for women. Many young brides entered marriage with little or no understanding of marital intimacy. Mothers, if they spoke of the subject at all, often couched it in vague warnings about duty and wifely obligation. The shock of the wedding night was profound for many women, and in some cases, deeply traumatic. Books and pamphlets circulated offering guidance, but these were often written by male doctors or clergymen who emphasized restraint, chastity, and the dangers of excessive indulgence. Women were frequently told that good wives endured sex for the sake of children, not personal pleasure. Men, on the other hand, lived under a different set of expectations. Victorian society assumed men had stronger sexual appetites and tacitly tolerated male infidelity. Brothels flourished in cities, and prostitution was referred to as the great social evil. A man who strayed outside his marriage risked little social consequence, while a woman caught in adultery faced total ruin. This double standard left women vulnerable. Husbands would bring home sexually transmitted infections, yet wives were often blamed for any resulting illness. The Contagious Diseases Acts 1864 to 1869 exemplified this injustice, allowing authorities to forcibly examine suspected prostitutes for venereal disease, while ignoring the men who patronized them. Contraception existed, but was stigmatized. Condoms made from animal intestines or later rubber were available, but using them was often considered immoral or shameful. Withdrawal and abstinence were more common practices, though unreliable. For women, childbirth was both expected and dangerous. The absence of safe, widely accepted contraceptives meant that many women endured a relentless cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and recovery, often at the expense of their health. Victorian doctors sometimes pathologized female sexuality, describing women who expressed desire as abnormal or diseased. At the same time, female pleasure was often dismissed or denied altogether. A wife's role was framed as passive, to submit rather than to seek. Yet beneath this repression, Victorians were fascinated by sex. Erotic literature circulated underground. Medical debates raged over hysteria and masturbation, and the contrast between public purity and private indulgence became one of the defining contradictions of the age. Motherhood was considered the crowning duty of a Victorian wife. A woman's worth was often measured by her ability to produce healthy children, especially sons. Yet the reality of childbearing in the 19th century was often grim. In aristocratic and upper-class families, producing heirs was essential for the continuation of estates and titles. Middle and working-class families, meanwhile, often relied on children to contribute to household labor or wages. Either way, women faced constant pressure to conceive and deliver. Marriage manuals and religious tracts reinforced this expectation, presenting motherhood as a sacred calling. Childless women were pitted or criticized, seen as incomplete in their femininity. The risks of childbirth were severe. Infections, hemorrhages, and complications during labor claimed countless lives. Puerperal fever, caused by unsanitary medical practices, was a leading killer. Even with advances in midwifery and the eventual introduction of antiseptic techniques, maternal mortality remained high throughout the century. For many women, the prospect of pregnancy was shadowed by fear. Every birth carried the risk of leaving children motherless, a reality well understood in households across the social spectrum. With little effective birth control, women often experienced 10 or more pregnancies over the course of a marriage. The physical and emotional toll was immense. Chronic exhaustion, malnutrition, and long-term health problems were common. Some women became permanently debilitated, their bodies worn down by the relentless cycle. Even when mothers survived, many children did not. Infant mortality rates were staggering. In some urban areas, 1 in 3 children died before the age of 5. Mothers lived with the constant shadow of loss, grieving babies who succumbed to disease, malnutrition, or unsafe living conditions. Despite these hardships, cultural ideals painted motherhood as joyful and sacred. Women were expected to embrace their suffering as a noble sacrifice, reinforcing belief that self-denial and devotion defined true womanhood. Victorian marriage was structured to give men overwhelming power, a dynamic that left women vulnerable to abuse. Under common law, husbands were long believed to have the right to physically chastise their wives. Although by the 19th century legal authorities discouraged overt violence, the cultural assumption that men had authority within marriage persisted. Courts were reluctant to intervene in domestic disputes, often dismissing abuse as a private matter. Reports of beatings, intimidation, and coercion were widespread, though rarely prosecuted. A wife who complained risked social stigma, disbelief, or even greater violence from her husband. Poverty magnified the problem. In working-class households, overcrowding, alcoholism, and economic stress often fueled cycles of abuse. Abuse was not only physical. Many women lived under conditions of psychological domination, cut off from friends, deprived of money, and denied autonomy. Husbands could control correspondence, restrict movement, and enforce obedience through intimidation. The legal system offered little recourse. Divorce was out of reach for most women, and separation carried enormous stigma. Shelters and protective institutions were scarce. A woman who fled her husband often found herself destitute, with no claim to her children or property. It wasn't until later in the century that campaigns for women's rights began to highlight domestic abuse as a serious social issue. Activists argued that the sanctity of marriage could not excuse cruelty, planting the seeds for future reform. Divorce, perhaps more than any other issue, revealed the hypocrisy of Victorian ideals about marriage. Before the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, divorce required a private act of Parliament, making it accessible only to the wealthy elite. This process was costly, public, and humiliating. For most couples, the only option was legal separation, which left both parties still legally bound in marriage. The 1857 Act transferred jurisdiction to civil courts, making divorce somewhat more attainable, but only in theory. The system still favored men heavily. Men could file for divorce on the grounds of adultery alone. Women had to prove adultery plus cruelty, desertion, incest, or another serious offense. This meant a wife could endure years of abuse and still be denied freedom, unless she could prove multiple wrongs. Even then, divorce carried enormous social consequences. Divorced women faced scandal and ostracism. Respectable society often viewed them as immoral, regardless of the circumstances. Their reputation suffered, their chances of remarriage dwindled, and their children often remained with the father. For men, the stigma was far lighter. A divorced man could remarry with relative ease, his social standing largely intact. Some divorce cases became sensational news, exposing the hypocrisy of Victorian marriage. Courtroom testimonies revealed affairs, cruelty, and scandalous behavior among the elite, offering the public a voyeuristic glimpse into private lives. Newspapers feasted on these stories, even as society maintained outward pretenses of moral purity. For many women, separation was the only option, but this too carried risks. A separated wife often had no independent income, no rights to her children, and no protection from further abuse. Some lived in limbo for decades, neither fully free nor fully married. Victorian marriage was not a single, uniform experience. It varied dramatically across class lines. The rituals, expectations, and realities of matrimony looked very different for the aristocracy, the middle classes, and the poor. Among the aristocracy, marriage was primarily about inheritance and politics. Families sought to secure titles, estates, and influence through strategic unions. Love was often secondary, if not irrelevant. Young women were groomed for presentation at court, where their eligibility as brides would be showcased. These marriages frequently involved significant age gaps, with young brides married off to older men whose wealth and estates needed heirs. Brides often had little say in the arrangements, their futures determined by negotiations between fathers and suitors. For the rising middle class, marriage symbolized respectability. Businessmen, professionals, and clerks sought wives who could embody the angel in the house ideal. A middle-class marriage was meant to display stability, moral uprightness, and adherence to social norms. Middle-class women were expected to run households efficiently, maintain appearances, and support their husbands' ambitions. While some enjoyed greater comfort than their working-class counterparts, they also faced suffocating expectations of propriety. At the lower end of the social scale, marriage was shaped by survival. Working-class couples often married young, sometimes hastily, as economic necessity outweighed elaborate courtship rituals. Weddings were modest affairs, often little more than church ceremonies followed by simple celebrations. Both husbands and wives frequently worked, with women contributing wages as factory workers, laundresses, or domestic servants. These dual responsibilities created a different dynamic. While men were still considered heads of households, working-class women often had more practical authority in managing family survival. Not all women married. By the late 19th century, census data revealed a growing number of unmarried women, often referred to as surplus women. These women, particularly in the middle class, faced limited options. Many became governesses, teachers, or companions. Spinsterhood carried social stigma, but also offered a measure of independence denied to wives. Religion played a central role in shaping Victorian ideas about marriage. The Church of England, along with other denominations, emphasized the sacredness of matrimony and the moral duties it entailed. The Church framed marriage as a divine covenant. Husbands and wives were expected to fulfill God-given roles. Men as leaders and providers, women as nurturers and moral guides. Sermons, manuals, and religious tracts reinforced these hierarchies, leaving little room for deviation. Clergy often preached the virtue of female obedience, citing scripture to justify male authority. Wives were instructed to submit cheerfully, endure hardships patiently, and find fulfillment in self-sacrifice. Husbands, in turn, were urged to love and protect, but the emphasis on obedience kept power tilted toward men. Marriage was not only about companionship, but also about morality. Couples were expected to uphold sexual restraint, avoid scandal, and raise children in Christian values. A wife's reputation was closely tied to her family's spiritual standing. The church's stance on divorce reinforced its near impossibility. Even after civil divorce became legal, many saw it as sinful, and clergy continued to condemn it. Women caught in abusive marriages were often counseled to endure for the sake of morality and salvation. Religion thus acted as both a source of comfort and a tool of control, shaping Victorian marriage into a structure that upheld social order, often at the expense of individual happiness. The Victorian age was also the age of empire, and marriage played a role in exporting British ideals across the globe. British colonial administrators, missionaries, and settlers carried with them the values of domesticity, gender roles, and moral respectability. Wives were expected to embody these ideals abroad, serving as symbols of civilization in colonial outposts. Interracial unions were viewed with suspicion and often condemned. British men in colonies sometimes married or cohabited with local women, but such relationships were stigmatized and rarely recognized officially. By the later 19th century, imperial authorities increasingly discouraged these unions, framing them as threats to racial purity. Marriage itself was seen as a microcosm of imperial order, the husband ruling, the wife obeying, children learning discipline. Just as Britain sought to govern its colonies, so too was a man expected to govern his household. The parallels reinforced both systems of control. Despite overwhelming pressures, some women challenged the Victorian marriage system, carving paths of resistance and reform. Activists like Caroline Norton campaigned for custody rights after losing her children in a bitter separation. Her efforts contributed to reforms in child custody and married women's property rights. Josephine Butler fought against the Contagious Diseases Acts, highlighting the double standards of sexual morality. These women, and others like them, drew attention to the injustices embedded in marriage, sparking debates that would fuel the women's rights movement. Novels of the era often exposed the darker side of marriage. Writers like Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot, and later Thomas Hardy portrayed heroines trapped in suffocating unions or struggling against social expectations. Literature gave voice to the frustrations many women endured silently. Beyond public campaigns, countless women resisted in smaller ways, delaying marriage, refusing suitors, pursuing education or work, or quietly managing finances behind their husbands' backs. These acts, while less visible, chipped away at the structures of patriarchy. Today, Victorian marriage is often remembered through a lens of romance, white gowns, stately ceremonies, and sentimental love letters. Period dramas and novels fuel the idea of a refined age of courtship and fidelity, but the reality was far harsher. Beneath the surface lay systems of control, inequality, and suffering. Marriage was often less about love and more about law, less about partnership and more about power. The myth of Victorian romance endures because it is comforting. It allows modern audiences to indulge in nostalgia, escaping into a world of carriages and ballrooms while confronting its darker truths. Yet clinging to this fantasy risks erasing the struggles of the women who lived it. By confronting the reality of Victorian marriage, we gain perspective on how far society has come and how much further it has to go. The struggles for property rights, custody, divorce, and equality were hard won, and their echoes continue in debates about gender roles, domestic labor, and reproductive rights today. Victorian marriage was not the romanticized union of novels and costume dramas. It was a system bound by law, shaped by religion, constrained by class, and enforced by social pressure. For many women, it meant loss of independence, repeated pregnancies, vulnerability to abuse, and little hope of escape. Yet within this restrictive world, women resisted, redefined, and slowly reshaped the institution. Their struggles laid the groundwork for the reforms and freedoms that later generations would enjoy. To look at Victorian marriage honestly is to see both the beauty of human connection and the cruelty of institutionalized inequality. It reminds us that behind every lace gown and flower bouquet was a story of survival, sacrifice, and resilience. And it challenges us to ensure that marriage today, in all its forms, is built not on control and duty, but on respect, equality, and genuine partnership.